Hello, welcome to this new video format that we're trying at the Schwarzkopf Foundation. I'm Nikita, I'm from the European Youth Parliament, and today I'll be joined by Adnan Ćerimagić, who's a senior analyst at the European Stability Initiative. Adnan also worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also did a traineeship earlier in the Committee of Foreign Affairs at the European Parliament. So Adnan knows a lot about foreign affairs, and we'll be talking about EU enlargement today. For people who may not know, in like one sentence or two, what is EU enlargement, simply put?
EU enlargement is about expanding the prosperity, peace, and the rule of law-based group or community to new countries that want to share this, and it's about building trust between these countries.
Adnan, anything from your side before we jump into the questions?
Well, I was thinking about our conversation about the EU enlargement, and I was recently asked, why do you deal with the EU enlargement? And I think it's a very important question because I think one can do a lot of work very well, but unless you have some personal emotional drive, then it becomes very difficult. So for me, it's extremely personal because I'm 39 years old. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I was 10 years old when the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina ended. It was one of the bloodiest wars with 100,000 people dead, 2.2 million people displaced, and almost 70% of buildings and houses in the country completely destroyed. So seeing my country after the war, as I was returning from the refugee place in Croatia with my mother and my brother, back to my father who was living there, it stuck with me this memory of a completely destroyed country, completely destroyed or disturbed connections between people, and all the efforts that were required and needed to rebuild it in a way that it was rebuilt. So for me, the EU enlargement is a way for not just my country, but for many, to follow the footsteps of other countries in Europe and to be able to join a place or a community of peace, but also community of rule of law, certain values and economic development and eventually prosperity.
I see. Thank you for sharing this personal side of this. I must say I relate. I'm from Georgia myself. I think growing up all my life I've heard about this Georgian aspiration to join the European Union. I think there was even this hoax, I'm not sure if it was ever fact-checked, that Georgia was the country with the most EU flags outside of EU. That's how big our aspiration was to join. Well, we'll be talking a lot about it, maybe even of Georgia today. I guess the first entry into the topic of enlargement that I'd want to have is that it's been 12 years since Croatia joined the European Union. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think this has been the biggest pause since the first enlargement. And a lot of this time, I think it seemed as though enlargement was something that's more or less paused, whereas now it seems more relevant. It's been talked about more, not just by EU officials, but then citizens and media. What do you attribute that to? Why is it seemingly more relevant now than it has been in maybe the years before?
Well, let me shortly first explain why I think that the enlargement did not happen from 2013, and why the Croatia is the last country that joined and is often seen as actually just a leftover or part of the big 2004 EU enlargement. And the reason is mostly because EU leaders of that time in 2006 and then afterwards have had a complete lack of imagination. On one hand, the 28 EU member states at that point felt very comfortable with where they are. They felt that they've expanded enough, that it's already a big union, but at the same time the union itself was facing a lot of challenges, from financial crisis, economic crisis, to migration crisis. And there was a sense, well, we need to take care more of ourselves. And there was a lack of imagination that countries surrounding the EU, from Ukraine, Georgia to the Western Balkans, where Bosnia and Herzegovina is, could one day really transform and change and become success stories like Poland or like Bulgaria, Romania have become through the process of integration, or Estonia or other countries. And another lack of imagination that things could get worse, and that can then have impact on the EU itself. They felt that there was a certain level of stability in these neighboring countries, and we don't have to deal with them anymore. I think 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia has completely distorted this sense of equilibrium or sense of security, and has basically, through this big passion of predominantly Ukrainian people, but also then Moldovans and Georgian people of wish to join to the EU, have helped EU leaders and EU countries rediscover enlargement as one of the instruments of stabilizing its neighborhood.
I see. Would you say the message is clear now, ever since 2022, that enlargement is something that needs to more actively come back on the table, or would you say the EU is still a bit torn whether this is the best course of action?
I think EU and its member states are democracies, and of course there are different opinions and different priorities. In that sense, I would say that at the moment we don't have a level of enthusiasm and agreement that, for example, led to 2004 Big Bang enlargement. There is no real decision by the EU 27 of allowing Ukraine, Moldova, and Western Balkans or Georgia joining the EU by certain moment of time. And the reason for that is, yes, they've rediscovered enlargement as an instrument to stabilize or to something to offer to its neighborhood, but I think there's still lack of imagination how all these countries can contribute positively to the EU. There's a sense of this enlargement is either our foreign policy tool where we prevent wars, or where we provide stability, and it's some kind of a gift given by the EU and its member states, its citizens, to its neighbors, while in fact, and history has shown, each enlargement was also about improving everyday life of citizens and economies of the EU over a medium and long term. And I think what we are still missing is this understanding that it's not just about a gift, it's not just about stabilizing the neighbors, but it's also about using potential that Ukraine, Georgia, Western Balkans have, and Moldova to contribute to a European continent and every of the 27 current member states.
I see. Maybe then this next question is a bit more difficult, but you mentioned moving away from this understanding of it's a gift that is given to countries. What steps do you see that must be taken for the world to move away from this understanding that it is a gift, and instead it can be something that positively contributes not towards the countries themselves that join, but then also towards the Union?
I think the EU 27 at the moment are going through a process which is very difficult and which is for many unheard of or unseen in the history of the EU. There's a lot of pressure on the EU, both from the East and from the West. There is pressure for the EU itself to fundamentally change. There is expectations from citizens which have not been met when it comes to economic development, when it comes to sense of security, when it comes to social justice. There is a growing sense inside the EU itself that the current models of economy, current models of political system, that they are not delivering as they have delivered before. So in that sense, it's as if EU itself is a construction site, and then we're talking about how to add new rooms or new sections to this already big construction site. But I think inside the EU, what is very much not discussed is about the young generation today. People who are 30, people who are 25 years old, they have grown up in 27 EU member states from birth to today, first of all in peace. They were brought up in a certain economic standard. They were brought up in certain development that they've accustomed to. And I think this is the generation that actually has most to lose unless the things unless we get things right, and part of getting things right is for me is also enlargement. Unless we really tap into potential that Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Western Balkans have, a lot of the things that are taken for granted today inside the EU will not be there. And young people are those who will the longest be living. So unless we really protect the peace, unless we protect this project that has enabled the development that it has, in fact, the young people have most to lose. So in a sense, what we also need in the debate is a clear voice from young people of their expectations and understanding what has, what were the conditions for them to have what they have, at least at the moment.
That's very true. I have a question about young people specifically, but I'd save that for a bit later. When you mentioned the role and expectations of citizens, I'd like to ask about this. I think growing up in Georgia, for me, there was always this, governments used to speak a lot about what does the Georgian citizens want. Do Georgians want EU integration or not? So I've heard a lot about this citizens' opinions and expectations from countries peeking outside of the EU in towards the EU. But then I'd want to ask more towards the opinions of EU citizens from your expertise and insight into this topic. How big of a role do EU citizens take on enlargement play, whether or not the EU prioritizes this to an extent? Because I imagine outside of citizen expectations, there's tons of factors, whether progress is made on enlargement or not. Would you say that expectations from EU citizens onto the EU plays a big role into this? And if so, how has it shifted over the last years?
Well, interesting that you mentioned the opinion of the citizens, because that is also what the European Commission wanted to have a look in September this year. They did a huge survey in 27 EU member states asking citizens if they support EU enlargement. If they do not, what is their biggest fear? What is their biggest hope for enlargement? And they asked for each in particular candidate of the 10 candidates to join the EU, how much of the support would they have for these countries to join. And it's quite interesting because overall, EU citizens in 27 EU member states support or have a majority support for EU enlargement. And for them, it's actually very clear why they support it. They think it's a way for the EU to expand the peace. It's the way for EU to expand its market, economy. It's about all the good things that they think that the EU enlargement brings. When it's boiled down to each individual EU member states, then in 23 there's a majority support for EU enlargement, and in 4 there are not. And those 4 are Austria, Czech Republic, France, and Germany. In Germany, around 48, I think, percent don't support future enlargement, but 43% support. And we're asked why do they don't support? They say that they are mostly afraid about migration, uncontrolled migration, that they're afraid about the costs of new enlargement. There is a sense that getting new members means that wealthy members like Germany need to pay for their development and for their transformation, and there is a fear of how the EU would function with more EU member states. And some of these arguments are valid, some of these fears are valid because more members means more difficult decision making. Some of these arguments like cost, especially in the case of Georgia, Moldova, Western Balkans, are not that big because it's small countries, small economies, but when it comes, for example, to enlargement to Ukraine, one can through negotiations work on the actual cost of the enlargement to Ukraine. So support from the citizens seems to go in a right direction in a sense that majority is supporting, but there are countries where there are challenges and there are some very valid arguments of why they are afraid and that need to be then addressed through the policymaking. And I would say that these, for example, this survey from September is being looked at very closely, not just by governments and by the European Union itself, but I would say also by candidates, because those countries that are close maybe to joining, they look at it very closely when they go to those countries to argue and advocate for their membership.
You see, that's very interesting. Has there been any similar surveys in the past that?
Sadly not. This is the first time that they did it in very detailed way. There has been traditionally survey with a general question: do you support EU enlargement, without all these details and breakdowns for the countries? And there, I have to say, for the past 20 years, there is a trend towards more support for EU enlargement. I think it reflects also the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but I would say it also reflects developments in some of the EU member states over the time, which have proven that, in fact, Baltics joining has not jeopardized the functioning of the EU. Poland is economically and in many other ways contributing quite a lot. So there is this reflects this. So the support was much weaker. At one point on the EU average, it was also below 50%. So now it's above, and that's considered as a progress in that sense. But as I said, the detailed surveys have not been done in the past. We will only have next year and year after that we would be able to compare in more details.
I see. Okay. Then I suppose we can look forward to some more patterns in the future. But then I want to ask about inside the EU itself. I think a lot of the times we've heard that for the EU to be ready for another enlargement, there is a lot of internal reform that must take place before. And now the Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos, has more or less alluded to that it might not be necessary for a big internal reform in the EU for an enlargement to take place. What's your take on this? Is someone very knowledgeable about this? Yes.
I think it can get very complicated, because I think, first of all, average citizens, even in the European Union, do not fully grasp the decision-making process in the EU. What's the Council for, what's the Parliament for, what's the Commission for, and this is more of a debate around the circles which do understand or which know more about. I think for the citizens, the perception is that it's complicated, and that with some member states like Hungary or even in past Poland behaving very selfishly in the sense of having their own single issue agendas, that they have disturbed these processes inside the European Union. However, I have to really underline that the reason why we have this big success with the EU in past decades is exactly because the processes take very long. So everyone's opinions are taken on board. There is a sense of security, there is a sense of safety inside these processes, that your arguments would be heard, you would know what the EU is preparing, you could be influencing it, and I think taking that away would give a big blow to EU as a project as such. I think, to make it more simple, there are a couple of parallel debates taking place. One is about decision making. Does every EU country have to have a veto on foreign policy, on the budget issues? And that's a debate that that is ongoing, and I have opinion that EU, because of its nature, will, even without the veto right, continue to have very long discussions before making decisions, so it will not speed up the processes too much. There is the other aspect of it, which I think for citizens is much more important, and that is all these different projects, the budget and the policies that the EU has. How are they being organized? What is their point? We have these big cohesion funds which are used to transfer the money in simple way to areas of the EU where development is not that big, to boost their development. Big debate is now, do we need to have this kind of policy anymore, or we really need to pool together our resources and invest in EU remaining competitive at the global market, like artificial intelligence, like digitalization, like infrastructure building. And this is kind of a debate that is ongoing, and I think it will it is extremely important in which direction it will go, because it will in a way decide on what the future of the European Union is, and what are the countries that the young people will be living in. So there are different opinions of how the money should be used. For example, also discussion is which countries should pay in more and which should get more from the EU. It is quite interesting that only couple of countries are actually paying in more than getting back. And after, for example, 20 years of membership for some countries like Baltics or Czech Republic, it is really a question, is it time for these countries to pay in more because they've reached certain level of development? So these are all ongoing debates that will obviously also determine in which direction the enlargement will go, because if the leaders, if the citizens feel like EU has looked internally, has reflected upon itself and has come out stronger, then there might be a sense also that then we can expand to other countries as well.
I see. You're right. It does sound pretty complicated, but it's much less so when it's kind of laid out like this. I also wanted to ask about the countries themselves. I think with, not to go in case by case for each of them, that might join, might not. But especially with some countries, we've observed this kind of 2 steps forwards, 5 steps back pattern to it. Namely, also the ones that I've observed in Georgia. I think some of the most maybe controversial debate that I've seen is this question of how can the EU sort of disincentivize steering away from the path towards EU to governments, but at the same time for this to not be punishing towards its citizens. So if you have a country where a big percentage of its citizens are very pro Euro integration, and this is also reflected in their demands towards their government, but then the government does not seem to necessarily subscribe to that, the same aspirations. What's the role of the European Union then? How?
Well, let me start by first saying that I think that the European Union and in general countries are very bad at doing foreign policy. So having really huge successes in foreign policy is really exception rather than the rule. And the EU over the past 60 years or even past 30 years has had a huge success with its EU enlargement policy as a foreign policy. If we look at Bulgaria today, Romania today, or Baltics today, no one in Germany or no one in France would be saying, oh, it would have been better if these countries were not part of the EU. Everyone would say, no, we're in much better position because they are with us, taking into account the pressure from the East, but also the pressure from the West. So the big question is, does the EU have this offer for all the countries that want to join? And that is debatable because a lot of countries like the Western Balkans have been told that they have this offer, but they did not really have it over the years because the EU was not ready to enlarge to these countries. And there's a lot of distrust in that sense. But in essence, if the EU is ready to offer membership to countries, then the governments that really do want, and the citizens who are able to push their governments to really want that, will be able to succeed. We've seen that in numerous countries, numerous contexts, different historical backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different language backgrounds, but it always worked when the EU was serious and when the countries themselves had the governments and the citizens. So I think for countries like Georgia, or for countries like Serbia, or for countries like North Macedonia, or even Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I come from, where governments are not that eager, to say it mildly, to work on the reforms that are needed for the integration process, I think their citizens and the government need to see other countries succeeding in this process, because for so long we haven't seen a country that has succeeded in doing that. We stopped believing that that is possible. So once, for example, today's considered frontrunners, Montenegro or Albania or Moldova, which is really doing enormous efforts in reforming itself, really do join the EU, I think there will be reflections inevitably in these countries and societies and the governments. Why are we not there? And why have we missed this train? Because today it's easy for these governments to say, well, we would want, or we're actually working on the EU integration process, but by not working, because no one is, it's not a process that leads somewhere. So I think one can manage these difficulties that these countries have individually as a foreign policy, but the EU will never be successful unless there is this aspect of the enlargement, which is the most successful foreign policy tool that the EU has had.
So to an extent, it's always going to be a risk of some kind when it comes to enlargement. Maybe there won't be a certain moment of decisiveness, whether it's the absolute right time to enlarge or not, but then history has shown that some of these risks have gone down well, more or less.
Yes, I think at this moment there's much more seriousness, both in Berlin and Paris and in other capitals, about really having enlargement taking place, but also about reforming the EU itself, changing some of the ways of how the policies are working or how decision making is working. But as I said, for years EU itself hasn't been able to change itself, but also hasn't been able to enlarge. And both inside the EU and outside of the EU, there is distrust that this time EU is serious. So we need to start seeing results before we start to believe again. And I think not in all 10 candidates at the same time with the same pace reforms can happen. It will be required that some countries move faster, some countries slower, some countries make steps back. But I think one can achieve results if one keeps the goal and is serious about that goal.
What I wanted to ask about next is to maybe put now more focus on the positive examples, the countries that are doing good. You mentioned Montenegro. We saw the EU 2028 campaign from Montenegro. What's your take on that? Is it too optimistic? Is this optimism nice for a country, a front-running country like Montenegro to have?
There are two countries which are doing exceptionally well since 2022 and this new momentum on the EU enlargement. It's Moldova first. Its government and its public administration, but also the EU support for them has really resulted with doubling, for example, the level of preparedness for the EU membership of Moldova. In Montenegro as well, in the past year, they've made more progress than they've made from 2015 to 2020. The question is, how do we know that? I think that's very important. And we know it because the European Commission has, over the decades, developed a very detailed system in assessing countries' laws, constitution, institution, practices, in implementing EU standards, EU legislation, EU rules. And they do every year an assessment and check of where they stand when it comes to level of preparedness. And like in school, they provide notes, grades from 1 to 5 on each of the 33 policy areas, from environment to quality of statistics to public procurement to judiciary, etc. And through this grading system, you can really see if they make progress or not. And when I say Moldova doubled its preparedness since 2022, or Montenegro made more progress in last year than from 2015 to 2020, I mean when it comes to this grades.
You have A+ now.
Well, they don't have. In 13 out of 33 policy areas, they're prepared for EU membership, but in the rest of the 20, they're on the way of actually maybe succeeding in being prepared by the end of the next year, which would allow them potentially, if the member states agree, to join in 2028 or 2030 in the EU.
I see. Okay. Then now to maybe zoom out of everything and go back to the start, especially for the people watching who may not know. What does enlargement really entail? As in, let's say we've decided it's happening, it's gonna go down. How does this take place in the European Union, and more so, what benefits should a country who aspires to join the EU seek from this process?
Well, we spoke about the peace, we spoke about economic prosperity, we spoke about security that the European Union has brought to its own citizens, and that some take it for granted, some, since invasion of Ukraine, take it more seriously. But in essence, there's very little discussion on why is that so. Why has EU been able to provide peace, economic prosperity, democracy to its member states, and how it has contributed to that. And I think this is the reason why also not a lot of people understand the concept of enlargement or what it entails in principle, because it's not about big words, it's not about big decisions. It's not about giving gifts. It's about building trust between not just citizens, but also between the institutions, between people of the country that wants to join and those countries that join. For example, we were drinking this tea today. If this tea was produced in Georgia or in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it would not be believed to be in accordance with the standards, in accordance with the standards that are needed inside the EU. So despite all the free trade agreements, despite all the support, on the border with the EU, this tea would need to be double-checked by the EU institutions. What the EU enlargement does is simply says, we go through the process, we look how your institutions work, we force you to implement certain standards and certain rules that we believe you that if the tea is produced in Georgia or in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that it can freely come to Berlin and be sold and people can drink it. That means that the trust between the institutions is built. So 90% of the enlargement process is about building trust, from what kind of statistics countries have to what kind of mechanisms they have to make sure that the tea is produced within the standards. And of course, even in Germany, sometimes tea can be bad and people can get unhealthy from it, and that would happen also in Georgia or Bosnia and Herzegovina. But we would have to trust that then once that happens, there's a system that will go in, check, that would correct the system. So while it's about big words, peace, and it's about prosperity, it's about the chance to be part of this big market, big economy and its rules, in the essence or at the really low, the really basic level, it's about building trust between countries that want to join and countries that are already in.
Great, beautifully put. Thank you for this explanation. I would, I think maybe building on this question, I want your opinion on again, a long time has passed since it happened. You were right to point out that maybe people stopped believing that it's even in the cards. How important it is that it is in the cards. How it's 12 years have passed. Can EU afford another 12? Do we not know this? Does the EU, would the EU benefit from speeding up its enlargement processes? Have they taken too long? On the timeliness of it, or maybe the future timeline that you envision that it might have. What's your take?
I think that what has changed since 2022 is that both the political leaders but also citizens do not necessarily have this lack of imagination anymore. They have seen things getting worse. They have seen things getting worse than affecting their everyday life, and they expect politicians and political leaders to come up with answers so that this is minimized in the future, or that it doesn't repeat in the amount that has happened. And I think EU enlargement in that sense plays an important role, not just because it forces EU to reflect its own policies, its own working, its own output for its own citizens, but it also forces it to reflect at what it wants from its neighborhood and how it sees itself in the neighborhood. So I think it's important to be on the cards, as you said, not just because of the countries that look upon and want to join the EU, not just because of the forces who are progressive, who want their countries to be reformed, who want their countries to be democratic based on rule of law and market economy, but also for the citizens and for the people inside the EU, because enlargement also forces EU to rethink itself, reflect itself, and to reinvent itself for the time that it is now.
I see. And speaking of the citizens, and namely young people among them, I think I speak from experience that there is this sense of hope that it is in the cards, especially among young people. And I wanted to ask, especially in countries where we've seen a lot of protests now, in Serbia and in Georgia, that maybe citizens and young people among them who disagree with the path that the government might have taken towards their aspirations for EU enlargement. I believe that among them sometimes it's difficult to look to the future more optimistically. From your perspective, and I guess us interpreting the EU perspective, what is an encouraging sentiment that we can offer young people? What is a bright outlook in the future, something that carries on this hope that they have?
I think, at least because I've been more talking to friends and colleagues and people who have been protesting in Serbia, but I guess it's same in Georgia. They hope that the EU doesn't make their life more difficult, because very often in the past, EU leaders have been talking to the leaders that have produced the reality in the countries that have endorsed them as reformers, as being progressive, etc. So they expect foremost for EU not to go anymore down that road. And I think with the new European Commission and the new Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos, a Slovenian politician or a former journalist and a diplomat, it has changed in a way that those reports that I mentioned, 33 chapters, 33 policy areas, state of judiciary, etc., that what in these reports it said, that is then reflected much better or much more realistic in what they convey. So the message is more and more coming from Brussels is that, yes, we agree, the rule of law situation in Georgia is bad, rule of law situation in Serbia could be better, democracy is not functioning, citizens have a right to be dissatisfied with the situation, and with that I think they are sending a message that they do understand the reality in which these societies live. As I said, to turn it around and to strengthen these forces in these countries, I think this will not be enough. What they will need is also examples, contemporary examples, where countries did succeed to transform, did succeed to build this trust with the rest of the EU, and then eventually join the EU. But I think as a starting point, the EU needs to much more speak about the situation in these countries as they are, and not in a way that they believe that that would allow them access to the current political leaders or favors from the current political leaders.
And then about these positive examples that you mentioned in countries, time for a hot take. When do you think the next country is going to join the EU? If you could have like an estimation of a year or a period.
I think that that before 2030 it's unrealistic due to the internal and dynamics, but also dynamic inside the countries that join. I also doubt that there will be a single country joining on its own. So if then after 2030 and more countries together.
Okay, we'll see. And then my take is that the EU won't take initiative on this unless they're absolutely forced to, and then it will be a haphazardly made decision that will be controversial.
On that note, we go to Moscow.
Yes. That's my hot take. Yeah, I suppose if multiple of them join, maybe would there be another long pause before then we talk even larger? Because at some point also nearby countries are running out.
I think it will depend on the state of the EU. So this reflection phase about the policies, about how decisions are being made, about the budget, who's funding the EU and how. If these debates end up in a satisfactory way for everyone to have more trust in the EU, in the processes, that will open a space for more countries to join. But at the same time, those other countries that are behind these frontrunners, Moldova, Albania, Montenegro, will also need to be catching up with the reforms. So the question is, will their path have spillover effect on countries like Bosnia or Serbia or Georgia? And I have to underline the big question. I mean, we are here today talking about the enlargement in a way that we are because Ukrainian citizens defended their country and expressed the wish to join the EU. Without them, we would have not been here. So the big question of the enlargement, after all, is what the EU can offer and will offer to Ukraine in the coming period, taking into account the peace talks and everything else. So that will also have a big impact on also others potentially joining.
And to summarize what we have said already, also shortly, with all of this in mind that we've talked today, what are the next steps for the European Union? What should the EU ought to take into account above all once it comes to enlargement and working with these countries?
thinking from the perspective of young people, EU enlargement is just one of the construction sites, or one of the topics that are extremely important determining their future. European Union over the past decades has provided a space for prosperity, space for peace, space for development, democracy and rule of law. And the questions about the future of the EU itself, how it's decided, how it's working, what is it offering to its citizens, are the big questions. And then the enlargement is simply part of that big question, and the answers there need to be concrete, need to be in line with the experiences of enlargement. That means some countries which are able to reform, which are able to build trust with the EU, should be allowed to join the EU by the end of this decade. And this will be the measure upon which people will be looking at EU enlargement, whether it has become a success again or not. So by the end of this decade, EU needs to find a way to integrate and enlarge to more countries.
Well, let's hope they find it, and then we'll see if they do. Thank you so much for your input and your insight. This has been Nikita and Adnan Ćerimagić. Thank you for following along this video. If you liked it, let us know. Maybe we do more of this format, and we'll see you later.